In the winter of 1887, a Russian census team entered a remote valley along the Yenisei River to record the scattered households buried in the Siberian wilderness. Their duty was routine: count families, list births and deaths, and deliver order to a land the empire barely remembered. But what they uncovered in one isolated hamlet was later struck from official records. Before we continue, a quick note. We uncover forgotten histories and mysteries every week, documenting the stories the archives tried to erase. If you'd like to hear more, subscribe to this channel. And in the comments, tell us, where are you listening from tonight? The place was known locally as Kiesel Hollow. No roads reached it. The team arrived by sled at dusk, the snow groaning under frozen runners. What greeted them was not the bustle of hearth fires or livestock, but silence. Smoke drifted from chimneys, yet no voices rose in welcome. The ground around the huts was scored with hundreds of small footprints, looping in circles, packed so tightly they formed grooves in the ice. When the officials entered, they saw men and women slumped at tables, gaunt with exhaustion. Mothers stirred weakly from sleep as the strangers knocked. Fathers staggered to their feet, their eyes red-rimmed. But the children, dozens of them, remained upright, barefoot in the snow, standing by hearths, moving in steady circles through rooms lit only by dying firelight. None spoke, none blinked, none closed their eyes. The team's written notes, preserved only in fragments, describe what they saw. We arrived past midnight. Adults collapsed into corners, unable to rise. Children continued to move. They hummed, a single low tone, as if in chorus. Their eyes reflected lantern light like glass. One census taker attempted to coax a young boy onto a cot. The child resisted, thrashing without sound. When held down, his eyes were sawn, remained wide, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. After hours, the boy still had not closed them. The parents confessed their children had never known rest, not as infants, not in youth. One mother whispered, "They were born awake. We have never seen them dream." Fathers admitted to desperate measures. Some tried to bind their children's eyes shut with cloth, others pressed narcotic herbs to their lips. None had worked. The children only grew thinner, their faces pale as wax, yet they continued their endless pacing. The team attempted to sleep that night. They could not. The humming never ceased. Low vibrations passed through the timber walls. In the morning, the snow outside was covered in new footprints, circles, spirals, endless paths traced through the night. One man wrote, "I have been among the Tungus and the Buryats. I have heard their tales of curses, but never such as this. These children belong neither to day nor night. They are caught between." When the census team returned south, the report they submitted contained no mention of Kiesel Hollow. On maps of the following year, the valley was left blank, marked only as forest. The officials did not speak of what they had seen, but their private notes survived, and with them, the first written confirmation of what locals had whispered for generations, that in the heart of Siberia was a place where children never slept. Long before the 1887 census team arrived, Kiesel Hollow had been known to those who lived along the great Yenisei River. To Russian officials in Krasnoyarsk, it was little more than a dot on a map, one of dozens of nameless hamlets in the Siberian wilderness. But to the Evenki and Ket tribes, its reputation was older, tied not to geography, but to the land beneath it. The hollow lay in a shallow valley cut between pine forests, reachable only in summer by boat or in winter by sled. No road connected it to the outside world. Families there lived by hunting elk, trapping sable, and fishing the icy streams that carved through the snowfields. In summer, the settlement looked like any other. Timber huts clustered near a frozen brook, smoke curling from peat fires, animals tethered at the edge of the forest. But neighbors said something in the rhythm of life was wrong. Folklore told of ancient graves beneath the soil, burial grounds disturbed when Russian settlers first raised their huts in the late 1700s. The Evenki called it the Valley Without Dreams. To them, sleep was not mere rest, but the bridge to the spirit world. Dreams were the path a soul traveled each night. To live without dreams was to live without a soul. Those who passed through claimed the valley itself resisted rest. Hunters said they never slept soundly near its borders. River traders told of voices echoing across the water long after midnight, and parents from nearby villages warned their children, "Do not look toward the hollow's fires at night. If you do, your dreams will be stolen." Orthodox missionaries began pushing northward in the 19th century, carrying with them icons and scripture. In their journals, some noted the hollow but avoided lingering. One fragment from 1839 reads, "The people there are pale and drawn. Their children walk after dusk as though compelled. I left before morning. By mid-century, rumors had hardened into something darker. Cossack patrols posted along the Yenisei warned travelers not to stop in the valley. They described its inhabitants as strange, watchful, unfit for settlement. Peasants whispered that families there had sinned against God, and that the sleeplessness of their children was punishment. Yet despite these stories, the hollow endured. 14 families made their lives there, tending fields, raising livestock, building small chapels where priests occasionally stopped to hold mass. To outsiders, the adults looked weary, hollow-eyed, aged beyond their years. But it was the children who drew attention. Accounts described them awake at midnight, eyes fixed on the snow, moving in steady circles outside their huts. One legend repeated among neighboring villages claimed that if you watched long enough, you could see the children's footprints forming patterns, rings, spirals, loops, as though marking some ritual in the snow. Another said that if you listened closely, their humming carried beyond the trees, vibrating low enough to rattle glass. By the 1870s, the hollow was less a village than a warning. Maps marked its presence, but records said little. The Tsarist government collected no taxes there. Military reports referred to it only as unsuitable ground. To officials, it was a blank spot, best left undisturbed. To locals, it was a place where children never closed their eyes, and where families lived as though haunted by something older than memory. In the winter of 1872, 15 years before the census men recorded their findings, an Orthodox missionary named Father Alexei Voronin traveled north along the Yenisei River. He was 33 years old, recently ordained, and tasked with bringing scripture to the scattered hamlets of Siberia. His tools were simple: a wooden cross, a bound Bible, a few icons, and a leather notebook in which he was instructed to record the spiritual health of each settlement. That notebook would never be published by the church. What survives are fragments, hidden for decades in a monastery archive. And those fragments are among the earliest written testimonies of Kaisel Hollow's curse. Voronin's journey lasted weeks. His sled runners cut across frozen rivers, guided by hunters who spoke reluctantly of the hollow. When asked about it, one muttered, "It is a place where night never ends." Another refused to continue when the forest narrowed, making the sign of the cross before turning back. He pressed on alone, arriving at dusk. The settlement appeared lifeless. Smoke rose thinly from chimneys, yet no voices greeted him. Footprints littered the snow, hundreds of small tracks circling the huts until the ground was worn smooth. Inside the first home, he found a family huddled near the hearth. The parents were gaunt, their faces drawn with exhaustion. But the children, they stood upright, motionless, eyes fixed on the flames. They did not acknowledge him when he entered. They did not lower their gaze when he raised his cross. That evening, Voronin held a service. He set icons on a rough table, lit candles, and recited familiar prayers. The parents mouthed the words with trembling lips, but the children stood apart. Their eyes did not blink. Their lips parted slightly. And then the sound began. It was not a hymn, he wrote. It was one tone, sustained without pause, rising and perfect, but a unison as though they shared one breath between them. It filled the room until I could not hear my own voice. My prayers dissolved against it. When he sprinkled holy water over one boy, the child flinched but did not recoil. Instead, the boy's gaze locked on the priest and the humming grew louder, pressing into the silence until Voronin's voice faltered. The parents wept. One whispered, "They have never slept, Father. Not once since birth. They do not close their eyes." The next morning, Voronin attempted catechism. He asked the children to repeat the simplest prayers. None complied. Instead, a girl began speaking in a language he did not recognize, harsh syllables, rhythmic like chanting. Soon the others joined. Their voices overlapped, rising in a chorus that drowned out his words. It was not Russian. It was not Evenki. It was not any tongue I knew, he recorded. But it carried weight. It pressed against the walls like wind. The parents bowed their heads. They said the children spoke this way often, and they no longer tried to silence them. At night, the priest attempted to sleep. He could not. The humming continued, steady and relentless. He swore he saw shadows moving in the corners of the hut, pale faces floating above him with lips moving silently. By morning, his hands trembled too badly to write. On his final evening, he walked the perimeter of the village. The snow was deep, but still he saw them. Dozens of children pacing in circles around the huts. He shouted for them to return inside. They stopped, turned their heads in unison, and hummed. I no longer trust my eyes, reads his last surviving entry. I no longer trust the hours. They wait for me even when I close my own. I feel myself being drawn into their circle. Father Veronin never returned south. Some claimed he perished in a storm. His body never recovered. Others said he lived, but never spoke again of what he had seen. Only his notebook fragments remain, and with them, the first written confirmation that the Hollow's curse was no mere rumor, that it was a place where children never dreamed. Long before the state acknowledged Kaisel Hollow, its reputation spread along the frozen trade routes of the Yenisei. Hunters, trappers, and river traders carried stories south, fragments written in journals, letters, and reports that together form the first external testimony of the sleepless children. One of the earliest accounts comes from 1864, a fur trader named Pavel Zorin. His surviving notebook contains only a single passage. We stopped at the hollow for shelter. The parents were as shadows, faces pale and broken. The children were awake when we arrived, awake when we departed. Their eyes reflected the torchlight like glass. They laughed, though no jest was spoken. They did not rest for a moment. I left before the dawn. Another piece of testimony comes from a hunter named Grigory Lebedev, who passed through in 1870. In a letter to his brother, he wrote, "I entered a cabin seeking food. The parents slept at the table, their heads fallen forward. The children stood by the fire, watching me. They made no sound except for a humming that shook the boards under my feet. I fled. When I returned for my pack at morning, it was waiting for me at the edge of the woods. No track showed who had carried it there. Travelers along the Yenisei began to repeat warnings. Do not eat in the hollow, do not sleep near its fires, do not linger past dusk. Still, some ignored them. In 1875, a Cossack patrol rode through to enforce tax collection. Their commander's report, heavily redacted, contains one striking line. We found children pacing barefoot in the snow. When addressed, they turned their heads as one. Several of my men reported hearing their humming even after we departed. The place is unfit for settlement. Surviving testimony from soldiers speaks of restless nights after leaving the hollow. Dreams interrupted, visions of pale faces peering through canvas tents. One trooper wrote that he did not close his eyes for 3 nights, convinced he could still hear the children's hum in the wind. By 1882, the stories reached foreigners. A German traveler, Karl Dietz, claimed to have stopped in the valley while on a surveying mission. His journal describes children standing in a circle outside a hut, their heads tilted back toward the sky. For hours, they did not move. When Dietz approached, they turned to him all at once. Their gaze did not belong to children, he wrote. It was as if something older was looking through them. These scattered accounts, traders' notes, hunters' letters, patrol reports, share unsettling consistencies. Parents described as weak, hollow, half-dead. Children restless, tireless, their voices humming in unison. Always awake at midnight, always circling the snow. The Evenki, whose lands bordered the hollow, offered their own explanation. To them, sleep was the gateway between worlds. To lose it was to lose the soul's passage. They said the hollow stood on violated burial ground, where ancestral spirits had withdrawn their gift of dreams. Outsiders repeated this in whispers, calling the place the Valley Without Souls. By the late 19th century, maps of the region omitted the hollow entirely. Travelers still told its story around fires, but in official records, it ceased to exist. It became a blank spot, a settlement reduced to rumor, remembered only in fragments carried home by those who refused to spend another night there. Fragments that all returned to the same image, children with eyes that never closed. By 1891, the rumors surrounding Kaisel Hollow had reached the provincial authorities in Krasnoyarsk. Traders spoke of children awake for days, missionaries sent fragments of journals, and Cossack patrols filed uneasy reports. For years, these accounts had been dismissed as folklore, but with whispers spreading along the Yenisei trade routes, the government decided to send a physician to investigate. Dr. Viktor Mikhailovich Sokolov, a military doctor trained in Moscow, was dispatched north with 2 assistants and a translator. He was a rationalist, convinced the reports described nothing more than a nervous disorder brought on by poverty and malnutrition. His notebooks, later found in fragments in a St. Petersburg archive, tell a different story. Sokolov arrived at Kaisel Hollow in early spring, when the rivers began to thaw but snow still covered the valley. His first impression was silence. Adults staggered from huts to greet him, their bodies frail, their faces hollow. The children, however, showed no such weakness. They moved ceaselessly between the homes, circling paths into the slush, humming in tones that reverberated against the timber walls. He began examinations at once. His notes describe what he saw with clinical detachment. Subjects exhibit no observable sleep, pupils dilated even in full darkness. No evidence of REM state even under induced narcotic. Mothers claim children have never slept since birth, bodies thin, muscle wasted, yet nervous energy remains constant. Several hum continuously, vibrations resonant through the sternum. Attempts to interrupt result in resistance, but not anger. It is as if they do not perceive me. He conducted tests. One boy of 9 was instructed to walk the length of a hut repeatedly while assistants timed him. After 2 hours, the child continued without pause. Another was given weights to hold until his arms trembled. He did not drop them. Sokolov's note. Physical weakness accumulates, but consciousness never surrenders. These are bodies in decay without corresponding surrender of awareness. Infants were examined as well. Mothers begged him for answers. They presented babies swaddled in furs, their eyes wide and glassy. One woman confessed she had fed her infant poppy resin, hoping to force rest. The child lay still for hours, but its eyes never closed. Even under narcotic influence, eyelids resist closure, Sokolov wrote. This defies physiology. Even in death, muscles relax, but these infants resist as if sleep has been cut from them entirely. At night, the doctor's team attempted to sleep. They could not. The humming filled the air, steady, unbroken, as though the sound itself denied them rest. In the morning, Sokolov found footprints circling the hut in tight rings, pressed deep into the snow. He wrote, "Exposure induces contagion of sleeplessness in outsiders. None of my party slept. Symptoms appear psychological, but cause remains unknown." His final entries betray a shift from reason to fear. Observed adolescent female standing before fire for 12 consecutive hours, gaze fixed on flames, eyelids dry, bloodshot, unblinking, no collapse. Parents near collapse. One mother begs me to kill her child, claiming he will never die otherwise. I could not respond. If sleep is the border between life and death, these children are suspended between. I cannot locate them within natural law. Within weeks, Sokolov abandoned the hollow. His party retreated south. One escort reportedly collapsed during the journey and died, not from wounds or illness, but exhaustion. His eyes remained open. Sokolov never published his findings. The fragments that survive were filed under unverified phenomena and sealed. His reputation remained intact. But in his private notebook, his law sent written words on Kysel Hollow were clear. Recommend eradication of the settlement. If sleeplessness is contagion, it must not be allowed to spread. For the outsiders who passed through Kysel Hollow, the sleepless children were an anomaly, an unsettling curiosity. For the parents who lived with them, they were a slow undoing. Fragmented testimonies, some collected by missionaries, others by Soviet ethnographers decades later, reveal households reduced to ruin by exhaustion and despair. One mother, recorded in 1893, whispered, "We have never known a night of peace. We beg them to lie down, to close their eyes. They resist as if sleep itself were poison. We sing them to rest until our voices break, but they only stare." Another testimony reads, "We pressed their eyelids shut with cloth. By morning their faces were raw, but they were awake still. We prayed, but our prayers returned hollow." Fathers turned to harsher methods. Some locked their children in cellars, extinguishing every flame, believing complete darkness would summon sleep. Witnesses said the children continued to pace through the night, tracing endless circles into the dirt floors until the ground was worn smooth. One father confessed to feeding his son alcohol, hoping stupor would force rest. The boy staggered, vomited, yet remained awake, humming faintly even as his body shook. Others sought shamanic intervention. The Evenki performed smoke rituals in forests, laying sleepless infants on stones said to belong to the dream world. Drums beat in steady rhythm, meant to mimic the heartbeat of rest. But each time, the children rose, eyes wide, their voices humming in counterpoint to the ritual. Missionary records describe a rising hysteria. "The parents come to us begging," one wrote in 1895. "They plead for holy water, for blessings, for exorcism. We give what we can, but nothing changes. They return again days later, their faces more hollow, their eyes more sunken. One mother clutched my robe and asked why God had forsaken them." Some parents reach To the edge of desperation. Stories circulate of infants smothered in cradles, of mothers lowering their children into icy rivers in hopes that death would release them from wakefulness. But even in death, something was wrong. A gravedigger recalled that the eyelids refused to close. Coins placed on eyes slid away, as if the gaze resisted burial. The hollow itself bore the scars of desperation. Huts filled with icons, their walls blackened by candle smoke. Carvings etched into beams, circles, spirals, crude words begging for sleep. The adults moved like ghosts, collapsing against walls or dozing in corners for minutes at a time. The children, thin and restless, continued pacing. A final testimony, preserved in a Soviet archive, is often cited as the most haunting. I have not closed my eyes in 10 years. When I do, I feel them watching. My children hum in the night, and I know they will never stop. There is no rest for them, nor for me. Not in life, not in death. By the end of the century, Kaisel Hollow was no longer seen as merely afflicted. It was cursed, and the people who lived there began to say aloud what outsiders had only whispered, that sleep had been stolen from them, and with it, their souls. By the turn of the century, despair in Kaisel Hollow had given way to ritual. Families no longer sought healing, they sought containment. If sleep could not be restored, perhaps it could be mimicked. What emerged was known among villagers as the ritual of shadows. The first mention appears in a confiscated gendarme report from 1904. Locals gather children in cellars, extinguish all light, and cover their faces with cloth. They chant in low tones for hours. The children do not resist. When cloths are removed, they remain awake, eyes fixed. Ritual repeated nightly. Eyewitness testimony describes the process in detail. At dusk, families led their children beneath the earth into cold dugouts. Doors were barred, candles extinguished. In the darkness, elders hummed in unison, producing a rhythm meant to call forth dreams. Children were laid on the ground, eyes veiled in black linen, while parents circled, whispering prayers to both Christ and older spirits. But the ritual never brought rest. After hours, the children began to hum back, voices vibrating beneath the cloth, tones deeper and steadier than their small bodies should allow. Witnesses said it was not the children who answered, but something speaking through them. A missionary who attempted to observe in 1907 recorded his impressions. The sound rose until the walls shook. It was not song but resonance, as if the air itself vibrated. Parents wept in exhaustion but could not stop chanting. When the veils were lifted, the children stood. Their eyes were wide, their voices continuing even without breath. The rituals grew more elaborate. Entire barns were converted into chambers of darkness. Families etched spirals into the walls, believing the symbols would guide the spirit of sleep back to their children. Survivors later recalled waking to find those same spirals carved into beams and tabletops overnight, though no adult admitted to the work. Hunters in nearby forests claimed they heard the ceremonies from miles away, low vibrations echoing through frozen ground like the murmur of a distant hive. One man refused to pass the valley again, saying, "It was as if the earth itself had learned to hum." By 1910, the ritual of shadows had become compulsory. Families feared that without it, the curse would spread beyond the hollow. They said the children grew restless if the ritual was missed, pacing violently, scratching circles into floors and walls until timber splintered. Icons were toppled. Doors shook on their frames. Parents repeated the ritual not as cure, but as bargain, to contain what they could not understand. To outsiders, the ceremonies confirmed the hollow's reputation. To those within, they became survival. But one thing was certain, the ritual of shadows did not return sleep, it only deepened the curse. For years, the children of Kaisel Hollow resisted exhaustion. Their bodies thinned, their movements slowed, yet none surrendered to sleep. But in the winter of 1889, the silence of the valley was broken by the first collapse. His name, preserved in one missionary note, was Mikhail. He was 10 years old, the son of a woodcutter. Witnesses said he had stood near the hearth for 3 days without pause, humming a single unbroken tone. His mother tried to force him onto a cot, pressing his eyes shut with her palms. His father held him down, whispering prayers. But Mikhail did not rest. His eyes remained fixed on the rafters. Then, without warning, he stiffened. His body convulsed once, and he fell still. The villagers gathered, hoping he had finally surrendered to ordinary sleep. But when they touched him, his body was rigid, his eyes open, glassy, and unblinking. Hours passed. His limbs did not soften. They attempted to prepare him for burial. Coins were placed upon his eyelids, a custom meant to weigh them closed. Each time, the coins slipped away. One witness recalled, "It was as if the eyes refused the grave." When Mikhail was lowered into frozen soil, his face was left uncovered, his gaze pointed upward, fixed toward the sky. The burial sent panic through the hollow. If the curse denied children rest in life, perhaps it denied them even in death. Parents feared their sons and daughters would not find passage into the next world, trapped awake forever. Testimonies described the aftermath. Mothers clutching infants, fathers performing rituals nightly in barns, villagers digging graves farther from the settlement, hoping different soil might accept the bodies. None trusted the earth beneath their homes. A missionary visiting weeks later wrote, "They showed me the mound. They did not speak his name. They said he was the first but not the last. They told me the earth rejected him, that it would reject us all. I asked what they meant. They wept and would not answer." By spring, other children followed. Each death bore the same signs: sudden collapse, bodies that stiffened unnaturally, eyes that would not shut. Some families buried their children in forests. Others weighted graves with stones. Rumors spread to neighboring villages that pale figures had been seen walking the tree line at night, children staring outward, silent, unmoving. From that winter onward, Kissel Hollow was no longer described only as afflicted. It was cursed ground, a place where sleep was stolen, where death gave no release, and where the gaze of children followed long after their bodies were buried. The winter of 1895 came early to the Yenisei Valley. Snow fell heavily in October, sealing Kissel Hollow in isolation months before traders expected. When spring thawed the river the following year, no smoke rose from the chimneys. Neighboring villages waited weeks for a sign. None came. Finally, a small rescue party was sent. What they found was recorded in a brief police memorandum, now redacted, but fragments survive. Entered the hollow at midday. No fires lit, no livestock. Doors barred but no sound within. Inside, adults discovered collapsed. Signs of starvation and exhaustion. Children still moving, thin, pale, pacing silently. Accounts from survivors in nearby settlements fill in the rest. The rescuers entered huts where parents lay slumped at tables, their faces sunken, hands rigid from cold. Entire families of adults had perished, their bodies frozen in positions of collapse. Yet the children were alive, dozens of them, moving slowly, humming faintly, circling the perimeters of homes as though keeping vigil. One rescuer later confessed, "They did not speak, they did not weep, they walked around the dead as if nothing had changed. Their eyes met ours, and we felt no recognition. Only watchfulness." The discovery unsettled the party so deeply that they abandoned the village within days. Several refused to return south along the river, claiming the sound of humming followed them into the forest. A written note, unsigned, was recovered in the belongings of one rescuer. "The parents were gone. The children remained. They do not belong to us, and we will not bring them home." No official record states what became of the children that winter. Some claim they were left in the hollow, pacing alone among the bodies of their families. Others insist they were herded into sleds and delivered to camps further south, though no census ever recorded them. A later miss. Ionary account suggests the first version may be true. He wrote that when he passed the valley years later, he saw no adults, only small figures moving among ruined huts, their voices humming against the wind. He did not enter. The Silent Winter, as later historians named it, became a turning point. The hollow was no longer seen merely as afflicted. It was cursed soil, a place where life and death had no boundary. Adults collapsed into graves of exhaustion, but children endured, tireless, suspended between states. And when outsiders left, they carried with them the same chilling refrain. The adults were gone, the children remained. By the late 1890s, new reports emerged from those few who dared approach the hollow. The children who had survived the silent winter no longer only hummed. They began to speak, but the language was not one outsiders recognized. A missionary fragment dated 1898 records the first account. They stood in a circle, their voices rising and falling in unison. It was not Russian. It was not Evenki. I could not place it. Harsh syllables, rhythmic and measured, repeated as though memorized. The sound chilled me more than their silence. Hunters along the Yenisei carried similar stories. One described watching a group of children by a frozen stream. They tilted their heads back, mouths open, speaking in tones he could not understand. When he approached, they turned to him, still chanting. He fled. Weeks later, he claimed he continued to hear the same syllables in his dreams. Doctors, too, noted the change. In 1902, a field physician who visited the valley recorded in his notes, "They do not hum now, they recite. Words unknown repeated in sequence. When asked to stop, they continued. When interrupted, they began again, as if the language exists apart from them, passing through rather than from them." What unsettled outsiders most was the uniformity. Children as young as 3 and as old as 12 spoke the same phrases, in the same rhythm, without error. None of the parents could explain it. They swore the words were not taught, that their sons and daughters simply began one night and never ceased. In time, researchers who later examined transcriptions noted similarities to archaic Samoyedic dialects, languages extinct for centuries. Others claimed fragments resembled ritual incantations, not common speech. One folklorist wrote, "It was not conversation, it was invocation, as if they were addressing something unseen." Parents began to fear the voices more than the sleepless. Some reported that when their children spoke, animals in the settlement grew restless. Dogs barked at empty corners. Livestock refused to eat. A farmer recorded in his diary, "When they chant, the house shakes. The words pass through walls like wind. We do not know who they are speaking to, but it is not us." By 1905, the phrase "the hollow has no tongue of its own" entered local folklore. It was said that the children no longer spoke as individuals, but as conduits, mouths for something older than memory. Missionary reports echoed this fear. One fragment ends with a line that was later crossed out. "The words are not theirs, they belong to the ground beneath." By the first decade of the 20th century, rumors of Kysel Hollow had spread too far to ignore. Missionary journals circulated privately, doctors filed sealed reports, and traders carried unsettling stories downriver. The authorities in Krasnoyarsk, alarmed by the persistence of these accounts, ordered a review. What followed was less an investigation than an erasure. A memorandum dated 1908 survives in part, stamped with the insignia of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. All references to Kysel Hollow are to be removed from census and parish records. Missionary reports to be archived under restricted classification. Dissemination of material describing anomalous behavior among children is to be considered sedition. Researchers later discovered that maps printed after 1910 omitted the valley entirely. Where earlier surveys showed a cluster of households along a stream, later editions marked only blank forest. Parish ledgers that once listed baptisms from the hollow contain neat excisions, pages cut cleanly with knives. The few reports that escaped censorship survive only by accident. One, preserved in the private papers of a provincial officer, describes the suppression directly. "I was ordered to strike their names, whole families reduced to lines erased with ink. When I asked why, my superior replied, 'Some places are not to be remembered.'" Missionaries who persisted were recalled or silenced. Father Mikhail Donskoy, who had written extensively about the children's chanting, was transferred to a distant parish. His successor was warned not to invent further heresies. In his farewell letter, Donskoy wrote, "They are not erasing the curse, they are erasing the witnesses." Meanwhile, local folklore hardened. In villages along the Yenisei, people noticed the absence of official mention. They repeated a phrase in whispers, "If the Tsar will not write their names, it is because the hollow belongs to no man." The censorship itself became evidence of something greater. To the authorities, Kysel Hollow was an inconvenience, a blemish best buried in archives. To the people who lived near it, the silence of the state proved what they already feared, that the hollow was not merely cursed, but dangerous enough to be forgotten deliberately. When the Bolsheviks seized power, their vision for Siberia was one of industry and order. Remote villages were folded into collective farms. Isolated settlements were either modernized or dismantled. By the 1930s, Kysel Hollow, long avoided and half forgotten, came under scrutiny once more. A Soviet directive from 1933, preserved in a Krasnoyarsk archive, makes brief mention. Valley settlement deemed unfit for collectivization. Structures to be dismantled, families relocated, records absorbed into district census. What followed was less relocation than obliteration. Survivors later recalled soldiers arriving with torches and shovels. Homes were emptied and burned, livestock slaughtered, chapels torn down, their icons confiscated. Families were loaded onto sleds and taken south under guard. But not all were accounted for. A border patrol officer wrote privately, "Children resisted transfer. They would not board the sleds. Some fled into the forest at night. The adults wept but did not stop them. By morning, several were gone, no record made. Official reports describe a clean operation. All residents transferred, village erased, land returned to forest. But oral histories tell otherwise. Neighbors claimed to see smoke for days after, rising from barns piled with timber. They said they heard humming at night, drifting downriver even after the valley was emptied. One fragment collected in the 1960s from a woman who had been a child in a nearby hamlet is particularly striking. They said the soldiers burned the hollow, but fire cannot burn sound. At night we still heard them, the humming, low, steady, carried by the wind. My mother told me not to listen, or it would follow me into my dreams. The Soviet government sealed whatever records existed. Census rolls for the region between 1930 and 1940 contain unexplained omissions. Names disappear without explanation. Villages listed on one year's map are absent the next. Kisil Hollow was among them. By the time the Second World War began, the hollow no longer existed on paper. In official terms, it had never existed at all. But silence did not erase memory. To those who lived along the Yenisei, the destruction of the hollow was not a conclusion, but proof. If the state could burn homes, move families, and bury ledgers, yet still fail to quiet the stories, then perhaps the curse had survived the flames. For decades after the Soviet erasure, Kisil Hollow survived only in rumor. Its name vanished from maps, its records scrubbed from ledgers. Yet in the late 20th century, fragments resurfaced, this time not in journals or testimonies, but in images. The first came to light in 1978, when a cache of photographs was uncovered in the belongings of a retired geologist from Novosibirsk. Most showed landscapes, rivers, and survey sites. But among them were 3 images marked only Hollow, 1936. The photographs were grainy, blurred with age. In each, a group of children stood in snow, thin and expressionless, their eyes reflecting the camera flash like glass. None appeared to blink. In the background, timber huts sagged, smoke rising faintly from chimneys. When shown to archivists, the images were dismissed as misfiled, yet rumors spread quickly. Scholars who studied them noted irregularities. One photograph appeared double exposed, faces overlapping slightly, as though caught in motion, yet each face was perfectly aligned, eyes fixed on the lens. Another seemed to capture figures in the background pacing in circles, their footprints forming faint rings in the snow. In the 1980s, more surfaced. A Moscow collector claimed to have acquired photographs smuggled from Soviet archives. These showed interiors of huts, children sitting upright by hearths, eyes wide, lips parted as if mid-hum. In one, an infant lay swaddled, its pupils reflecting lamplight with an unnatural clarity. Critics dismissed them as forgeries, staged to exploit folklore, but others insisted they were genuine. One historian wrote, "The expressions are too vacant, the poses too consistent. These are not performances, they are conditions captured on film." Local testimony supported the claim. Families along the Yenisei recalled Soviet soldiers carrying cameras into the hollow during its erasure. None of them photographs were ever published. If the images now circulating were real, they had escaped state control. The photographs became a point of obsession among researchers. Enlargements revealed details overlooked at first glance. Circles carved into wooden beams, spirals etched into floors, strange symbols scratched into walls behind the children. In one image, a boy stands before a hut. His shadow stretches behind him in winter sunlight, but alongside it is a second, fainter outline, shaped like his, but misaligned, as though cast by another light unseen. Whether authentic or fabricated, the photographs ensured Kisil Hollow could no longer be dismissed as rumor alone. Written testimonies might be doubted, oral histories could be forgotten, but images carried weight. And the images showed children awake in the snow, their eyes fixed on the camera, unblinking. By the 1990s, the Soviet Union had collapsed, and archives once sealed began to open. Rumors of Kisil Hollow resurfaced among researchers, folklorists, and journalists eager to uncover what had been buried. That decade, an expedition was organized by a small team of academics from Novosibirsk State University. Their goal was simple: to locate the ruins of the hollow and determine whether the stories were myth or memory. What they found was never officially published. Only fragments of their notes, recovered years later, provide a record. The team entered the valley in late autumn of 1993. Snow had already fallen. According to field journals, the remains of huts were still visible. Timber walls collapsed, roofs caved in, cellars buried under drifts. Inside, they discovered evidence untouched since the 1930s. Rusted cooking pots, broken icons, rotting timbers marked with carvings, spirals, circles, and crude symbols repeating across beams. But the most disturbing finds were the claw marks. Deep gouges scored the interiors of cellars, long arcs etched into wood as though by fingernails. One journal entry reads, "Marks consistent with frantic scratching, but too high for infants, too low for adults. Pattern suggests children, pacing, reaching." The team brought recording equipment. One night, they left an audio device running inside a ruined hut. When they returned the next morning, the tape contained a sound not heard during the night itself. A faint, continuous humming, low and steady, rising and falling in rhythm. One researcher described it as the sound of wind through a hollow reed. Another insisted it was voices. The expedition did not end cleanly. In December of that year, 2 members failed to return from a survey of the valley's edge. Their sleds were found intact, their notebooks abandoned in the snow. The pages ended mid-sentence. No bodies were recovered. The incident was never entered into official records. Colleagues back in Novosibirsk claimed the missing men had been victims of exposure, but locals along the Yenisei repeated a different story, that the hollow had taken them. In 1997, a Moscow journalist published a short piece in an obscure magazine citing anonymous sources within the team. The article described photographs of small figures in the snow captured at the edge of the valley. The images were never released. The article concluded with a single line, "The hollow remains awake." Since then, no sanctioned expeditions have returned. The valley is marked on maps as forest land. Hunters avoid it. Locals still whisper a faint humming carried on the wind in winter, and researchers speak of the 1993 expedition in hushed tones, a warning rather than an invitation. After more than a century of scattered testimonies, censored reports, and rediscovered fragments, Kissel Hollow remains unresolved. Historians, scientists, and folklorists continue to debate what happened in that frozen valley where children never closed their eyes. The explanations fall into 3 familiar categories. Some neurologists argue the hollow may have suffered from a rare genetic disorder, an undiagnosed form of fatal insomnia, or a neurological defect that prevented REM cycles. They point to families marrying within the settlement, the possibility of hereditary disease passed through generations. Yet no medical records confirm this, and no similar condition has ever been observed on such a scale. Others insist the curse was not natural, but manufactured. Soviet researchers in the 1930s were known to experiment with sleep deprivation, testing its effects on endurance and obedience. According to this theory, Kissel Hollow may have been chosen as a site of early trials, its strange reputation a convenient cover. But no documents have surfaced. Every relevant file remains redacted, sealed, or destroyed. For many along the Yenisei, the simplest explanation is also the oldest. They say the hollow stood on violated burial grounds where ancestral spirits once guarded the passage of dreams. By building homes atop those graves, settlers severed the link between body and soul. Their children were born awake, denied dreams, denied rest, denied the path to the afterlife. One fragment, collected from a survivor decades later, captures the belief. We were punished not for what we did, but for where we lived. Sleep was taken, dreams were stolen. Without dreams, we had no souls. None of these theories resolve the mystery. The village was erased, yet its stories persist. The photographs remain unexplained. The audio tapes from 1993 are still whispered about among researchers. And the testimonies, hundreds of them, scattered across centuries, repeat the same image. Children pacing in snow. Children humming in unison. Children awake. If you've stayed with us through this story, thank you. We uncover hidden histories and disturbing mysteries from America's past every week. Make sure you subscribe to Classified Ledgers so you don't miss the next case. And before you go, let us know in the comments, would you have dared to spend one night in that hollow?